Welcome to this Personal Tutoring Refresher Screencast. I'm Eileen Pollard and I've recently joined the UTA as a lecturer in academic development. I've previously taught English literature in higher education for the last 10 years, primarily at the University of Chester, where I was a senior lecturer and programme leader. I've also had a range of experiences as a personal academic tutor or PAT, and I'm looking forward to sharing some experiences of this complex role in this screencast. So, the session content and learning outcomes. This session has been designed according to the constructive alignment guidance from Biggs and Tang, and the session will help you to discuss your level of knowledge and confidence about personal tutoring as a role, the framework and the policy at Manchester Met. The session will also help you to share some examples of the 3 C's of personal tutoring practice in your department. It will help you to choose appropriate coaching questions in relation to the GROW coaching model. And finally, it will help you to generate responses to a case study using the BATHE coaching model. So you can see that I'll be introducing you to 2 different coaching models in the screencast today. If you have any further questions, my contact details will be shared at the end of the screencast. So we'll begin with what you feel your level of knowledge and confidence is at the moment. On a scale of 1 to 10, how knowledgeable and confident do you feel about personal tutoring and coaching? I also want you to consider whether there is an overlap between personal tutoring and teaching. I suggest that you pause the screencast now to consider these questions for a few minutes. How did you get on? It might be worth considering discussing some of your answers with a colleague. I'm going to outline now the personal tutoring policy at Manchester Met and its connection to my 5-year plan. The current personal tutoring policy was developed following an FKey funded research project on personal tutoring at Manchester Met. It was conducted by colleagues in UTA, and that research has been published and is available from the UTA website. My 5-year plan can be delivered through personal tutoring, and it is at this time, but it can also be delivered through units. So they are connected, but they're also different. This is the statement that describes what personal tutoring should look like at Manchester Met. It is a student support system delivered by academic staff through a coaching approach that recognises the importance of personalised and individual support in creating equal opportunities for students to succeed and fulfil their potential through a 5-year planning approach to personal, academic and career development. This statement was developed through a number of focus groups with various stakeholders, including students and academics. The activity of personal tutors, as a result, can be divided into these 3 key areas, known as the 3 C's here at Manchester Met: course, i.e. progress and attainment; community, belonging, confidence and support; and career, planning and goal setting, and of course, writing references, etc. The suggestion of UTA is that you use a coaching approach to help support all of these areas of activity and take a 5-year plan approach to them as well. I'm now going to suggest that you have a think about these 3 C's in terms of your department and your activities. So those 3 C's that are guiding personal tutoring at Manchester Met are, as a reminder, course, focusing on support for academic progress; community, building through encouraging participation in a learning community and signposting to support services when required; and career, planning support towards an identified career path. So course, community, career. I'd like you to pause the screencast now to consider what activities express these 3 C's of personal tutoring in your own department. I'd like you to spend a few minutes on this activity, pausing the screencast, and if you're not sure, then this would be a good opportunity to seek further advice from a colleague. How did you get on? Remember, it's important to note that a coaching approach can be used to support all of these activities. So if you're feeling unsure about how to deliver them, the next few slides should be helpful. The role of the personal tutor is a difficult one to define, and it has changed over the years. This table, adapted from Lockety et al. 2018, is designed to help you think about the differences between the personal tutor as a tutor, a coach, or a mentor. In a moment, I'm going to ask you where you would place yourself on this table at the moment and whether or not you find this table helpful. But just to note, we've got personal tutoring here in the first column, and down this side we've got things like approach, focus, context, how it helps learners, to help us understand what we see personal tutoring as. In the next column we've got coaching, so again there's a sense that these two are connected with this dotted line, but there are distinctions. And then finally mentoring in this last column, again a dotted line but different again. I'd like you to pause the screencast now and spend a few minutes considering where you would place your practice at the moment in terms of personal tutoring, and if this table helps, how it helps. How did you get on with that? It's a difficult exercise, and I've found that I've changed throughout my career from one to another, or utilised different approaches with different students. I'd now like us to have a think about ways that we can go about the personal tutoring role itself. So taking some of that information from the left-hand side of the table and putting it into some other models. So here we've got Gravels and Wallace 2007 being adapted by Clutterbuck, so that we can see the differences between these different types of role, so coach, caretaker, counsellor, facilitator, in terms of how they're directing or not the students. So on the non-directive side of this axis, we've got facilitator and counsellor, but on the more directive side, we've got coach and caretaker. And then again, on this axis here, going across the middle, on the one hand, we've got people trying to support the students as caretakers or counsellors, but also on the other side, we've got colleagues trying to challenge students or push students by being coaches or facilitators. Like with all models, this is a guide. It's not to say that you're going to fit neatly into any or all of these categories, but they're useful to consider because we move between them. This is a slightly clearer version here, where we've also got the idea of passivity, activity, slightly different words being used, nurturing versus stretching. And we've got slightly more information here under facilitator, counsellor, caretaker and coach. So we've got some ideas here about what a coach might be and how that might work. Okay, again, what I would like you to do is a check-in exercise here. I'd like you to consider which areas are you most comfortable with. what might influence that approach? The thing about personal tutoring is that most people will have a preference in terms of these 4 areas. So I'd like you to consider now which one you're most drawn to, but I also want you to consider why that might be. How did you get on with that? One of the things that I found when I was a personal tutor was that I often found myself leaning more towards this side of the square. But really what I wanted ideally was to be more on this side of the square. So having something like this can help you reflect, but also can help you take some more practical steps towards a different approach. We're going to have a think now about the use of coaching and a practical approach to this in terms of different types of question. So one definition of coaching is this one from Whitmore 2002, that coaching is about unlocking a person's potential to maximise their own performance. It is helping them to learn rather than teaching them. So it is very much a guide from the side approach rather than a sage on the stage. I think the other thing that's worth bearing in mind here as well is something someone said to me about coaching, which is based on a different model, which is that as a coach, you are committed to the player's goal. You're not committed to the player themselves. And I think that helps us as academics as well, that we're committed to the student's attainment rather than what the student might want themselves. We need to be committed to their goal. Okay, so you might be wondering how you do all of this kind of work. This is another model which I think is quite helpful. So here we have this staircase moving from a directive style where you're solving someone's problem for them, and I'm sure we've all been in that position where a student has come with a very specific problem and we've gone straight into a directive push style, telling, instructing, or potentially even just doing things on their behalf. But these steps take us further and further up so that we get to a non-directive or pull style, where we're trying as far as possible to help someone solve their own problems. So again, what we can see in the coaching definition, that we're helping the person to maximise their own potential and performance rather than just doing things on their behalf. And I'm not saying that with any judgment, I've definitely done that myself, but I would urge you to think more about how you can move away from telling and instructing to giving advice, offering feedback, making suggestions, reflecting back. If there was one thing that I could really change about the way that I was a personal academic tutor, it would be to try and do that more, to say to the student, so is this what you're saying? And reflecting it back to them so that they could hear it themselves. I'd like you to pause the screencast now and to consider both the definition from Whitmore. You might not agree, you might have a different definition. I'd also like you to consider where you'd place yourself at the moment on this non-directive to down to directive scale. So I would say that I actually fell into this category quite a lot, and that when I was at my best, I was in the middle, somewhere here, asking questions, trying to raise awareness, making suggestions. But where I'd really like to have been was up here, reflecting back to the student what they were saying. So pause the screencast now and consider this definition and the non-directive questioning. I hope that was helpful. I'm going to move now to the next slide, and we're going to have a look at the GROW coaching framework. So I want you to imagine that a student has made an appointment to discuss how they move from the 2-1 band to the first class band. I'm fairly sure that most academics have been in this position at some point, and it is a very, very common question, and sometimes it's something that can come up in personal tutoring. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to use this framework. But what I've sneakily done is I have mixed up the questions here. Okay, so just ignore this column for the moment and focus in on what we've got here, which is the actual framework itself. So you start off by working out what the goal is for the student by asking certain questions around what their goal is. Then you move on to what is the reality of the situation at present, again through questioning. Then you think about the options, so you move on to something that's quite practical, and then you consider the will. What is the commitment of the student? So again, you know, like with all of these coaching frameworks, there is an element of common sense, but I think what's helpful about them is that it helps you progress through the steps. So instead of dwelling upon a problem or sticking with, I really want this to happen, you make sure that you keep moving. So I'd like you to consider now which of these questions fits with which of these sections of the framework. Okay, so like I said before, I've muddled these up. And I would like you to put them in the right order. So which of these questions do you think would help you work out what the goal was? Which of these questions do you think would help you work out what the reality for the student was? And so on. So I'd like you to pause the screencast now and consider that, as well as considering how this framework might be useful in such a scenario. Okay. I will move to the next slide in just a moment to explain which questions I think fit best with which part of the framework. But I'd just like to note here that you can refer to all of our personal tutoring resources on the UTA website, and the link will be on the final slide, and the slides will accompany this screencast. Okay, so these are the questions that I think fit best with each of these parts of the framework. So as Richard says on Pointless, very well done if you've got these answers at home. The goal, what do you want? You know, so a simple question like that, perhaps not asked in quite such a directive way, but trying to work out what the student actually wants. So in this case, we're fairly sure that they want to move from 2-1 to first, but what does that mean? What do they really want to aim for within the first class band? It's a big band. What's the reality? Where are they up to now? You know, is this a student who is in the 2-1 band, or is this a student who's averaging in the 2-2? What can they do? And I think this is such an important question because it turns it back onto the student. So instead of them coming to you and you providing them with the answers, and we know how difficult it can be to provide any answer to this particular question other than what's already provided, it puts it back on them. So what can you do? How can you push your grades up? And then finally, action plan. You know, what are they going to do about it? And this leaves it with them, which I think it is also quite important. Okay, so I hope that you found that helpful. In terms of this particular model, GROW, it's generally used most successfully for proactive personal tutoring meetings and conversations. So this is where the student has made an appointment with you and they've got a particular question. So it's not a crisis, essentially. So like the example that I gave, this is somebody who wants to push up their mark. So that's what we would call a proactive personal tutoring meeting. However, it doesn't always work that way. I want us to consider the other side of things briefly now, which are to do with when you get to a point where your support of the student has been exhausted. So this is where we have to let go or we have to refer. So when do we do that? Okay. It's possible for us to let go in certain circumstances where we have outlined all of the advice and guidance, and then it's up to the student. But if we have concerns about them, then we need to refer. So maintaining confidentiality. So I wouldn't share this with colleagues unless it's possible for you to do so. I would like you to think about when you most recently thought your own support of a student had been exhausted. How did you know that, and what did you do? So I think that we can all instinctively know when we've got to a point where actually we can't give any more to a particular student because we haven't got the training, we don't necessarily have the expertise, we could do more damage, etc. We all know when we've reached that point, but I want you to consider how you knew that. And then what you did next. So pause the screencast now to consider this question, maybe make a few notes, think about some specific instances. Okay, so again, maintaining confidentiality, that might be something that you want to discuss with other colleagues and share knowledge and understanding of when you reached that point and how you knew. In terms of what you did next, I'm sure lots of colleagues are aware of the referral guide, but I'd just like to share it now. So this is the 21-22 guide. I'm sure that will be updated for the forthcoming academic year, but it is just brilliant. For specific issues, please try to use it. So you can see at the bottom of the page here that we've got lots and lots of separate categories for students needing advice on very specific things. So I would really urge you to use this if you've got the student in front of you, make sure they're aware of it, or you can always direct your tutees to the student hub. There are two that are physical hubs, one in the business school, one in Brooks. But if you believe there may be a safeguarding issue, there is specific guidance on the safeguarding intranet pages. So what I would really urge you to do if you haven't already done this, and I'm sure many colleagues have, is to just make sure that pages like the student referral guide and the safeguarding pages are bookmarked on your PC so that if you've got a student in front of you, you can find that information quickly. It's also worth knowing that down here, in terms of well-being, if you or the student or both of you aren't really sure what kind of support they might need, you can complete this, or rather they can complete this short wellbeing support questionnaire, which will give them a clearer sense of what to do next. Okay, so there are resources available, and it's just worth having them as shortcuts. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next slide now to introduce a different case study. So this is an example of what we would call a reactive meeting. This is when a crisis occurs, as opposed to a proactive meeting, which is timetabled or initiated by a tutor. So this has happened to me. I'm sure that this has happened to many colleagues. A tutee knocks on your door without an appointment and they are upset. I'm not wanting it to be a supreme crisis in this particular case study, although that will potentially happen from time to time. I just want you to consider them as upset, because what we're going to do now is use bathe on this case study. Okay, so I said before, if you've got a proactive meeting where a student has initiated it or you've initiated it, you can use grow, but if it's reactive, I think bathe is potentially better. Okay, so again, another mnemonic, bathe, I think is helpful because it is soothing. And these are the questions that might be useful to have to hand. So, trying to get some sort of sense of what's going on, what's the background, how is it affecting you? So obviously they're upset, but how are they upset? In what kind of capacity are they upset? What's troubling them the most? So trying to get to the heart of the problem as quickly as possible. What are they already doing? Now, I really think that this is such an important question that I often didn't ask myself. How are you handling it? So giving them some agency back, some sense of control, and some sense that they are actually dealing with it already. And then finally, demonstrating empathy. And obviously, I'm not suggesting that you wouldn't be demonstrating empathy all the way through, but it can be useful just to mark to the student that you understand that this is difficult. Apologies for the question mark at the end there. Obviously, that one's not a question, it's more a statement. Okay, so that's the bathe model. Slightly different to the grow model in that it's really staying with the problem as is at this time. And that brings me to the end of my slides. What I have here, as you can see, are my contact details. I'm very happy for people to Teams me as well. I'm on Teams and I can be contacted via email at that email address. So if you've got any questions following this screencast, then please do let me know. This is an overview of the resources which you should be able to access through the slides that accompany the screencast. So all of these are hyperlinked, as you can see, some of which I've referred to during the course of this screencast and some of which I haven't. So here's the policy. There's some information about Presto, which some colleagues find incredibly helpful in terms of keeping up with where students are at in terms of their engagement. I also have put a link here to the UTA personal tutoring resources. And I've got the student referral guide, which I mentioned, student code of conduct, which is worth having a link to, and also the staff wellbeing resources, so looking after yourself in all of this. I mentioned Lockerty, key figure in personal tutoring, and also there's the UK Advising and Tutoring Association, UCAT. It's the sectoral voice and leading association for personal tutors and academic advisors, and they provide lots of resources and sessions on personal tutoring, including some free webinars and recordings. So that's really worth knowing about as well in terms of external support. So that brings us to the end of this screencast. Thank you for listening to this personal tutoring refresher, and if you have any questions, please do get in touch.